Honduras is one of the poorest countries in Central and South America, but there's a new idea about to be tried in Honduras. It's called a ZED, a privately run zone with legal, economic, and political autonomy. The laws are all in place, investors are lined up and ready to go, and the big question's about to be answered. Will this actually work?
This is not a model city. This is not best practices. This is Ayn Randia.
The Zeds faced their fair share of this sort of criticism early on, when their biggest proponent, economist Paul Romer, branded them charter cities.
We need to allow for the potential for partnerships between nations.
Some critics even worried that Romer's ideas amounted to nothing more than repackaged colonialism.
Cases where nations work together, in effect, de facto, the way China and Britain work together to build first a little enclave of the market model and then scale it throughout China.
Romer's idea to partner with host nations proved controversial and unconstitutional. Romer left the project, and the Honduran Congress revised the law so that the Zeds would be run by private entities instead of foreign governments.
We have a reputation of being a very corrupt country.
Today, it's not so much ideological opposition to capitalism or abstract concerns about colonialism that makes most Hondurans skeptical. It's something much more ingrained and fundamental to Honduran society, a distrust of their own national government.
I have this suspicion of not knowing if they're making these decisions because they actually think it's the best thing for Honduras, or is there some other kind of interest behind?
Claudia Maria Castrovalle is a professor of law in San Pedro Sula and says the details of the plan remain murky and raise more questions than answers for her. What
will be my rights as a Honduras citizen? Will I be allowed inside these zones? Perhaps it's an easier way to get hands on our natural resources, for example.
Students in Valle's class also feel like they just don't know enough about the plan to give their full support.
It's just that we don't trust the politicians. Who's going to be ruling about it? The government? Because if it's the government, it's a failure system.
I have many questions about it, like many doubts. I think it's good to be positive, but you also have to be realist.
Maybe it's not that we don't believe in this project, it's just that we think it's gonna happen and it's gonna fail because of the same thing that all the other projects have failed before.
You have to remember that when we began the discussion on these zones, we had just began to come out of a political crisis, the political crisis of 2009. This whole effort is about moving away from trusting individuals and creating the institutions that can be trusted by the general public.
The problems that exist are actually the reason why the ZA is necessary. It's the instrument that can attract the levels of investment and create the number of jobs that Honduras needs to escape from poverty.
Mark Klugman, a board member on the committee responsible for greenlighting the zones, says the project may need time to prove itself to Hondurans, but the governance in the zones will be the kind that has proven itself over and over in other parts of the world. He calls the idea institutional leapfrogging.
Institutional leapfrogging is to draw upon what actually exists and is proven. Usually it's things that are very old. It's things that are very familiar. There's a reason why the Honduran design speaks of Anglo-Saxon common law, because it's essentially internationally, it's the standard.
But even some people rooting for the success of the Honduran Zeds have reservations about Klugman's approach.
There are aspects of the Honduran reform that don't mirror certain essences of the startup cities idea. One of the essence of startup thinking, of course, is that you need multiple different approaches to the same problem so that one will stick. All of our eggs cannot be in Honduras' basket.
Startup cities, Honduran Zeds, Klugman's leap zones, charter cities are various technologies. I want a more diverse conversation about these technologies so we can find the best path forward for billions of human beings.
To say that this project should be focused on things that are experimental? No, sir. The problems are pretty clear. You have a country where every year 75,000 people essentially risk their lives, in many cases go into debt with very dangerous criminal organizations that will try and smuggle them into the US. A lot of them get on a train called La Bestia, and they have to hold on to these rails on the train. They're riding outside the train. They have to hold on for hours. And as happens, they get tired, and if they let go or they slip, a lot of them will slip under the train and will lose an arm or a leg. I mean, that's a reality. When you have so many people living in a precarious condition with such limited options that the bestia, the beast, is their best alternative right now, my response to people who say, listen, I've got a really clever idea and I would love a place to try it out, and you guys, I don't know how you've done it, but you've gotten this thing done. Would you please try out my cool and groovy idea? What would you say to them? Say, listen, I love your cool and groovy idea. That's really not on our to-do list right now.
Will the Zeds fall victim to cronyism and business as usual, as its critics fear? Or will they outcompete the nation-state as the world's primary form of government and alleviate global poverty on a scale never before seen, as its most ardent champions insist? Only time will tell. But as the project inches closer to reality in the coming months, we turn to actual investors with money on the line to see what they envision for the future of Honduras and its Zeds.